It's been over a month on a war that was supposed to be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. Instead, tonight, the battlefield tells a different story. Sirens continue to echo across Tehran. US and Zionist strikes intensify, targeting energy infrastructure, industrial zones, and strategic facilities. But Iran is not backing down. Its air defenses have reportedly inflicted some of the most serious losses on US assets in decades, challenging a long-held assumption and contested American air superiority. And now the clock is ticking again. The US president says he has given Iran an extension to his deadline to make a deal. Then he goes back and retreats about it and says the date is still the same. All this through the Strait of Hormuz, and now it has until maybe Tuesday morning to take a decision. But this is no longer the first or ultimatum nor the second. Each deadline has shifted, each red line was blurred, and tonight the real questions are unavoidable. Is Washington losing control of the escalation ladder? Is this war exposing the limits of American power? And why are even its own intellectual architects now sounding the alarm? All these questions and more will be put to our panel in All 24 News special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition on this special coverage about the war in Iran. And before we bring in our guest, day 38 of the war is now defined by three converging realities: military resilience, diplomatic deadlock, and economic shock. Well, let's find out more in this report by Zara Ferjani, and then we get back to the discussion.
Tensions remain high in the Middle East as fighting between Iran, the United States and the Zionist entity escalates both militarily and diplomatically. Iran has rejected a temporary ceasefire, insisting instead on a comprehensive and permanent end to the war. Tehran has submitted a 10-point response to Washington's proposal, calling for an end to hostilities, along with sanctions relief, reconstruction efforts and safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, while insisting on guarantees to prevent future U.S. Zionist attacks. The Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baqai said Washington has undermined diplomacy, stressing that Iran will not negotiate under threats or ongoing attacks on its infrastructure.
Deadlines should not cause us to show the slightest hesitation in defending our country. Our demand is clear: an end to the imposed war with guarantees that this tragic cycle will not be repeated. Tehran has finalized its diplomatic response to the United States and will announce it at the appropriate time.
Meanwhile, pressure is mounting from Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has issued a final deadline, giving Tehran until Tuesday to reach an agreement, warning it will otherwise face what he called a heavy price.
They've made a proposal, and it's a significant proposal. It's a significant step. It's not good enough, but it's a very significant step. We are obliterating that country. And I hate to do it, but we're obliterating, and they just don't want to say uncle. They don't want to cry, as the expression goes, uncle, but they will. And if they don't, they'll have no bridges, they'll have no power plants, they'll have no anything.
On the ground, the conflict is intensifying. Joint U.S. Zionist airstrikes have targeted key petrochemical facilities in southern Iran, including major complexes in Bushehr and Escalation, triggering large fires and explosions. Critical infrastructure sites supplying electricity, water and oxygen to industrial zones were also hit, marking a second wave of strikes on similar facilities within 24 hours. Iran says it has shot down drones over Isfahan and Kermanshah. The human toll is also rising. At least 38 people have been killed, including children, with dozens more injured in large-scale strikes across the country. For its part, Iran has responded with a new wave of military operations. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced the launch of its 98th wave of attacks under what it calls Operation True Promise 4. With diplomacy stalled and both sides escalating, fears are growing that the conflict could widen further as deadlines approach and retaliatory strikes continue.
To unpack all of this, we are joined tonight by an exceptional panel. We have Dr. Kelly J. Shannon, historian of U.S. foreign policy and Iran from George Washington University, joining us from Maryland. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And also, we're joined by Ms. Adeshua Josh, International Affairs Correspondent, joining us from New York. Welcome, ma'am. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Kareem. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And also we're joined by Mr. David DeRoche, Defense and Gulf Security Expert from Thayer Marshall Institute, Washington, D.C. Thank you for agreeing to be with us, sir.
It's an honor.
And we also have the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Gregory Simons, geopolitical analyst and academic PhD researcher, joining us from Dhaka. Hello there, sir.
Hi, Karim. Good to see you in the morning.
Got to see you too. And Mr. Mohammed Krissassi, financial and geopolitical analyst, with us here in the studio. Hello, Mohammed Krissassi. Thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thanks for inviting all your honorable guests.
Thank you. Welcome to all of you. All right, so let's start the debate with you, Mr. DeRoche. We've seen repeated ultimatums from Donald Trump. We no longer know how many hours are left. Sometimes he comes and says they have until Tuesday and then until Wednesday. We have conflicting reports. So what is this extension, then new deadlines? At what point does deterrence become inconsistency here?
Yeah, well, I don't think this is deterrence. It's something else. It's hard to tell. I mean, the thing about President Trump is he talks a lot. I mean, I think in his first 3 months, he spent more time talking to the press than his predecessor did in 4 years. But he talks without notes, and he often talks without discussing matters with his team, and sometimes he contradicts himself, you know, within 5 minutes of each of them. Look, his background is not as a diplomat, it's not as a statesman, it's not as a general. It's as a businessman. In business, you dissemble, you throw out a weird idea, not because you expect it to be accepted, but because you want to rattle the other person or you want to see how far you can push them. It's very unstatesmanlike, it's businesslike. And it's what you expect of a person who works construction in New York, which is what he is. So I don't think he knows what it is. I think that he knows that he has a rough idea of what he wants. But I think that I suppose the most favorable interpretation you could get would be that this ambiguity stresses the Iranians. It's better from a military perspective for them to have a broad range of deadlines that they have to plan against rather than one point that they can synchronize all of their defensive things on. But I think this is just a tick of his character.
But then if Iran continues to resist and respond, does this suggest that the U.S. escalation threats are no longer having the intended effect?
Well, I don't think they have had the intended effect. I mean, look, Iran from the start attacked neutral third states. That's where they're exerting most of their power. It's in the GCC states. Iran has fired twice as many ballistic missiles into the UAE as they have into Israel. And it's against neutral civilian shipping in international waters, the Strait of Hormuz. So that deterrence, any effort to deter those actions has clearly failed. I think that at some point we're going to go beyond the deterrence, the political concept of deterrence, to the military concept of incapacity, of removing the capability to do that. I think President Trump's threats, the Iranian regime clearly cannot accept those because they know that that would lead to the end of the regime. So unfortunately, I think that this is the preface to an extended military campaign and an extended period of higher energy prices around the world, which is probably good news for your viewers at home as an energy producing country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed for that insight. Now, let me include Dr. Simons here. Dr. Simons, from a geopolitical perspective, how damaging is it when a superpower moves its own red lines repeatedly? Does this accelerate a shift toward a world where U.S. warnings carry less weight?
Absolutely, because what you're seeing from Trump now is a mix of desperation, political desperation. He has dug himself a hole he can't get out of. So he tries to resort to his traditional, if we want to call them that, tactics of bluff and bluster, because in Trump's own words, he has no cards to play, and the cards he does play come with negative consequences. And so, I mean, he continues to attack civilian infrastructure, and in return, the Gulf states, who are not neutral, if they allow military attacks on Iran from their territory, under international law, they can be attacked, and they have been, not to mention what Israel is taking in terms of damage, which they're hiding from not only the international community, but their own people. So this is why he keeps on pushing things back. He's trying to find an off-ramp, which he cannot find because he doesn't understand Iran or the Iranian people who are fighting an existential war. His war of choice is on display to the world now, and especially these continuous war crimes which are being perpetuated by the United States, attacking such things as nuclear power plants, which is insane. I mean, if there is something there going off, it's not going to be Iran as the main recipient of the fallout. It's going to be the Gulf states, and not to mention schools and so forth. The rest of the world, especially the global south, sees the US in all of its rather, should we say, hostile and very aggressive emperor with no clothes. And so, I mean, if you just look around the global south, and if we look at Bangladesh as an example of this, there is, I mean, already there was an existing negative view because the US was seen as being complicit in the genocide which is ongoing in Gaza, and now it attacks another sovereign state and is waging a war not only on the state but the civilian population too, and is unable to achieve its military objectives because the political objectives are unreasonable and not something to be accepted by a country of 93 million people. This is not a small, fragile state like Iraq or Libya.
Mm-hmm. And this raises the question of legality. Thank you, Dr. Simons. Let me include Dr. Shannon when it comes to the legality of this war, especially when we have these threats that we're going to have strikes on critical infrastructure. That's going to be considered like a collective punishment, especially if you go and you threaten to hit power plants and so on. All this raises serious legal questions, Dr. Shannon. So where is the line between the military necessity here and unlawful targeting?
That's a great question. I think historically, because we've seen wars that have intentionally targeted civilian infrastructure, not just the atomic bombs in World War II, but also the fire bombings of Dresden and Tokyo, the blitzkrieg on London. We get the Geneva Accords that come out of World War II, where there's broad international agreement that civilian infrastructure should not be targeted intentionally, that countries persecuting war need to take steps to distinguish between military and civilian targets. And what we're seeing is, from the president's own rhetoric, a real clear message that the targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran is intentional, and it's meant to be punitive. And so it's very clearly, because especially the way that it's being framed, it's very clearly a violation of international law. And we also see, the Iranian government doing the same thing, and as well as committing horrific human rights violations against their own people. But the question is, who's going to hold the US and Iran to account for these crimes after the war is over? Neither one belongs to the International Criminal Court. And so I think that's an open question, where we have a broad agreement, because the US especially is not claiming that they're targeting electric plants because it's supplying electricity to the military. Instead, they're saying we're going to punish the Iranians, they're punish the Iranian people. We're intentionally going to target these civilian sites. I mean, they struck some universities in Iran, in Tehran recently. It's very clearly a violation of international law. But the question is, who's going to do something about it?
Exactly, because this seems to be stretching, let's say, that line. Now, maybe we can even speak about undermining the legal order. And when we speak about the West, generally, in the global South, we know that the West, led by the United States, always claimed to uphold world order and legal order. But then we see all these violations. So what about this credibility? Is anybody going to believe in, let's say, international world order?
It does severely weaken the post-World War II international rules-based order that was very carefully constructed in the wake of that war. If you have the United States or Western countries really openly tearing up those principles, it then emboldens other countries, especially those who've been more skeptical of these kinds of rules, like Russia and China. It emboldens them to similarly disregard these rules. If the West, who really insisted on these rules, isn't following them, then why should they? This is very serious. I think it's going to make it very difficult to come back from after this war. But this administration seems like it would like to act unilaterally and without restraint. And that involves tearing up the rules-based order, both internationally and at home, in ways that will make it very difficult to try to reconstruct afterwards.
Yeah, thank you indeed. Now, let me bring Ms. Adeshua. Ms. Adeshua, so how differently is this war being framed inside the U.S. compared to international coverage? Are we witnessing perhaps a widening narrative gap?
Oh, Kareem, there is certainly a huge difference in the way the narrative is framed here in the United States compared to a lot of international media. When you look at about 10 years ago, I'll say less, you would have had to just analyze between liberal and conservative media to try to figure out what's going on. Now there's a whole cacophony of voices, ideas, just in the middle, riding on the platform of social media. Most people turn to TikTok and turn to Instagram and the like to get or to try to figure out what's going on. And they are as powerful as mainstream media. As a matter of fact, many of these influencers and publicists and whatever you want to call them, surrogates, have their agenda given to them, or they get the news statement, etc., and then they dumb it down to whatever their followers are expected to hear. And so you have to, then you go from conservative to liberal and then to everything else in between to try to figure out what's going on. But for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to try to outline it into three. There is mainstream media, and there is a whole spectrum of how this is being covered. There is a security logic to it, which covers self-defense, deterrence, and counterterrorism. Remember that the president of the United States said, "Oh, this is why we are going to war with Iran, to make sure that we to destroy their nuclear program, to make sure that we act first, otherwise they're going to attack us first." So it all fits into this three prism, which is self-defense, deterrence, and counterterrorism. And the main sources for whatever it is that you hear, both in liberal and conservative media, is being funneled through. They're getting it from mostly government sources, right? And also there is this linguistic difference with how Western media is covering the war, at least in the United States. You see that Western coverage frequently frames the United States and the Israeli action as defensive, while portraying other adversaries as provocative or aggressive. There is also the evidence, if you take a look at it, especially after there is a major key event, the coverage of humanitarian condition sort of goes down depending on who is affected. So you get to see that. But that's not to say on the flip side it's not the same. When you compare it with the international media, say DW, or you say CGTN, or perhaps even Al Jazeera, which has been heavily covering both the Gaza war and this one now, and the war in Lebanon, you see that there's greater emphasis on humanitarian impact. And that's what you do as someone who spent 20 years in the newsroom. When you are in doubt, they would ask you, just focus on the people. When in doubt, when you don't know what to do, when it looks like the lines are blurred, you put the people at the center of your story. So while there are editorial angles to every story that is being covered, the wise way that you have seen that Al Jazeera has done it over all through the years of this war is to put the people at the center of it. However, you get to see that the access that they have to certain people is more than the other people. You see what I mean? So there is humanitarian impact. You get to see that there's a lot of humanitarian angle, whereas in other places you get to see a lot of political and a lot of policy angle reporting. There's also a lot of emphasis on international law and proportionality. You would see some people have criticized that Al Jazeera is heavily framed around Palestinian civilian experience. And, well, geographically, that explains where they are, explains a lot. European outlets, however, have been sitting in the middle of this reportage. You know, they are a bit cautious. There's a mix of security framing, illegal moral scrutiny of the United States and Israeli actions. This is how this is how both the U.S. and the international media have been framing the reporting of this war. To cut the long story short, there's language. There's a lot of emphasis on language. You know, you hear retaliation, you hear attack. It's all narrative. It's all the way it is carved, depending on who is perpetrating what. There is also whose suffering is being centered, and also what counts as a starting point of the conflict in the first place. So there has been indeed a huge difference between how the United States, the media in the United States is covering this war, and has always been, and how the international media is covering the war. Karim.
Excellent, excellent. Here, this leads me to you, Mr. Mohammed Kourisasi. While there is this war of narrative, every single media is kind of covering the news from their angle, depending on which side they are perhaps with. But then the reality is something that everybody can feel. Perhaps the lucky ones are the ones who can feel inflation. Maybe they have to pay maybe extra dollars. The less fortunate, let's say, are the ones being bombed and the ones being killed. Now, what can you tell us about the reality on the ground when it comes to economy and how Europe is going to be impacted, how the average American is going to be impacted by this war, and let alone if Donald Trump goes on with his threats and actually does it?
Well, to answer this question, you have to go back to the factuality. You have to do a reality check here. Yes, Europe is suffering, but this is their own making because they let them self-drive by Trump, who doesn't have any strategy. And before the suffering, economical suffering that you are seeing today is coming, and now Europe is feeling it as well as you said, other countries, it's from their own making. The Detroit of Hormuz was fine before Trump declared war on Iran. In the beginning, it was because of the nuclear power, and then it come for the change of
regime.
Go ahead, help me out here.
Yeah, the regime. Yes.
The regime, and then now it's a global trade war. Mm-hmm. America, again and again, I say it many times, doesn't import oil; they export oil. What is the meaning behind this? Who is going to suffer? You talk about Europe. Europe have a war, the one in Ukraine. And nobody wants to stop that. Why is it that? And it's impacting all the economy of Europe. Ukraine was the first provider of the grain, for example. The oil, yes, it's important. The Detroit of Hormuz in 90% of the passage. But why we have to go to that extent? And a tree is not going to hide the forest. They did it. And I think I'm not a complotist, but when you hear Trump giving all this BS, and saying that today is 48 hours, tomorrow is 10 days, now is tomorrow at 8 p.m. What is the meaning of it? They don't have any strategy, and the global economy is suffering. Why? Because they look for security. If you don't have security, you are going to have the supply shock because of the way the goods have to go through. You have to have the cost, push inflation, as you said. Also, what you call in economics, the stack inflation. And finally is the supply chain. What is the supply chain? Is you and me, what you are going to have in the table at the end of the day. So if you don't master that, I don't care about the narrative that you can hear from here and there. The reality is, let's go back to the negotiating table. Let's say the truth. Who is to blame for all this chaos? It's not Iran. Iran never attacked anybody. It was a war by proxy for who? For Israel. A country of 9 million people, 3 million of them are also Arab-Israeli. For the rest of the world, why is it? Yes, they are going to suffer. And they did, as I reiterate, they did it on their own making. It's not Iran. And how to stop that? Simply to go sit down at the peace table. Why the negotiation moved from the GCC to Pakistan? Because it's a reality check. Pakistan is a Muslim country. They have the deterrent on nuclear power. And also, they are not going to listen only to the American what they would like to do, and if you don't accept it, they will go. Pakistan is going to stand up and say, no, this is not the way. If you want really to negotiate, you have Turkey, you have Pakistan, and you have Egypt. And then, as you can see, the four of them are Muslim. They understand the culture. Because whatever I heard now, again and again, the religious factor is there. When you heard today, the Ministry of War of Trump, what did he say? We have to go back and protect our Judeo-Christian culture. And why is doing that? What does this have to do with it? For me, is because they want to destruct whatever Muslim country try to emerge from their non-willing, they are going to cut their head. And unfortunately, for them, Iran is not Venezuela. Iran is as big as Europe. Iran is 95 million people. Iran have 3 million people waiting for them since 40 years. They were waiting for that and they are ready for it. Now the GCC, yes, is there, but what did they do to protect themselves? They call America. America is not protecting them. They are going to suffer economically. Europe is going to suffer, yes. And we have also another element that you have to take in consideration. China, Russia, and the BRICS. The BRICS wanted to take off the sacrosanct dollar. China, they have to protect their own source, which is 60% for energetic source coming from Iran. And you have Russia, they are there to help. Why? Because they cannot stay just on the sideline. And don't forget, Russia is going to be the beneficiary of all this because they have also the petrol. Look what India did. They didn't listen to Trump. They went to Russia to have their... So again, to answer a question, Europe is suffering and they are going to suffering until the day they come, sit down and say, like they begin to do now, like Spain, like Italy, say, we don't want to be in this. This is not our war, it's yours. It's a war of choice against a war for self-defense is Iran, is not Israel. I don't know if I answered the question, but I tried my best.
Well, technically, the economic suffering is there and is going to be felt by everybody in the region and globally. And here, I get back to you, Mr. Dirache. If we are going to speak about the reports that suggest losses of advanced systems and drones on the part of USA, even if partially accurate, does this indicate that Iran's capabilities were underestimated?
Well, no, I think it indicates that a lot of people don't understand what the military concept of air supremacy means. So basically, the coalition can fly anywhere in Iran that they choose to make an effort of, but there is always the ability for a local force to have a shoulder-fired missile or to conduct an ambush on short notice, particularly as pilots become more and more confident, maybe get lowered to the ground. So the metaphor here would be, if you look at, say, Canada, the Royal Canadian Air Force has air supremacy there, but somebody with a shoulder-fired missile can camp out at the end of the runway at Toronto International Airport and bring down a plane. When you look at earlier campaigns, for example, Operation Desert Storm, the coalition so far has launched about 3 times the number of sorties, with the loss of one crewed airplane to enemy action. With a third of the sorties in Desert Storm, about 68 manned aircraft were lost. A lot of attention is being put on the drones. The drones are known to be slow, loud. They're called flying lawnmowers. They were designed to operate in a place with no real air threat, basically Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they're being phased out of the inventory by 2027. So, it may seem, these are expensive. They were expensive to make, but we have them, and they're about to be retired. And you've seen the efforts that the United States goes to protect one of its downed crewmen. So, to have that level of persistent observation, even with a relatively high rate of loss, is actually pretty good. And the calculus is that if a drone completes 4 missions, it's already paid for itself. So, this kind of logic. We talk a lot about asymmetry with a country like Iran, where Iran says we can take more punishment than you can. We can, we will kill as many of you as we can, and your tolerance for casualties is much less.
For them,
and I
technically,
think that's true.
for them, kind of resilience and defending themselves is considered a victory. Of course, it's being pounded by the day, by the minute, and there is definitely considerable damage to the country, Mr. Darash. But then what I want to say is that does this pattern where technological superiority actually guarantee battlefield control, although we can all see that this is very costly?
Well, that's I was gonna complete my thought, which was there's an asymmetry on our part too, which is that $30 million may be a lot of money to Iran. $30 million that was spent 10 years ago is not a lot of money for us, and we have an asymmetry where we can afford to lose, particularly the uncrewed assets, and those are replaceable. So if we have to destroy 2 C-130s at a rescue site because they stick in the mud, well, we have 600 others. Iran, on the other hand, our asymmetry is loss of life on our side. Their asymmetry is aircraft. Their President Raisi, died in a 50-year-old American helicopter that in the United States is used by the San Diego County Sheriff's Office. It's not used, for a head of state. So their asymmetry works on both sides. And I think when people look at, the number of RQ-9s shot down, it's interesting. It's not something that you seek out, but it's more of an irritant than a game changer. We talk a lot about the asymmetry that you spoke of resilience and the culture of resistance, but I don't think there's been much study of the asymmetric advantage that comes from having a lot of equipment and being able to sustain losses that would be very, very significant for Iran.
That's clear. And now, Dr. Simons, if we come to look at this rise of some kind of a new kind of deterrence where regional powers and superpowers can impose real costs on global powers, and we have just been listening to Mr. Darash saying that perhaps the United States can take these kind of losses because it's a resilient country. When it comes to the economy, perhaps they have a way bigger budget when compared to Iran, but then the impact is felt globally. How do you comment on this?
No, the US will not be resilient in this respect. They do not like losses, and ultimately it's politics that is going to decide this. I mean, you're right about the losses. I mean, they're hiding it. You look at CENTCOM, they hardly give a press release. I mean, they gave, since the 31st of March, they've given one press release on the 5th of April. There's a lot being hidden from not only the US public, but globally what they're losing. And I mean, you look at that debacle, the so-called rescue of this pilot. I mean, if you want to about making things great again, this is like making Operation Eagle Claw great again, which was, of course, the debacle in 1980 when the US thought they could just fly in and rescue the hostages from the American embassy in Tehran, just like a Hollywood movie. And this was immediately after the Iranian Republic, Islamic Republic was created. What you see today is a very different structure, and they completely underestimate the Shia understanding of honor, of martyrdom, these kinds of things. I mean, clearly, we've moved from the age of Sleepy Joe to demented Don, who is detached from reality. He's just floundering about. And the world, I don't know how this is viewed from the US, apart from, for example, Jimmy Dore, Judge Napolitano, these kinds of things. But I mean, the rest of the world sees them completely exposed. And I mean, Iran is not a maritime, it's not an aerial power. This is not the source of its power projection. It's a continental power. And if the US under Trump is stupid enough to go in for a land invasion, and I don't doubt the level of Trump's hubris and stupidity to discount this possibility, then it's going to be a very problematic issue militarily, then politically. I think one thing which is currently going under the radar is that the real hurt to the West, that's Europe, but also US and so forth, is the fact that the growing season in the Northern Hemisphere is beginning, and a lot of the fertilizer comes through the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. And this is going to lead to things in months when you're going to have a significant food shortage, in addition to the increased cost of oil and these other increased costs. So, yeah, I mean, you don't even get the usual vassal states from Europe joining this adventure. I mean, you even have Macron apparently come to some kind of arrangement with Iran because now they understand the US has never had other people's interests at heart. They follow their own game, and now we see the results in West Asia, and the results, the effects, I should say, are going much beyond West Asia. They're going to touch Europe. I mean, they're touching the US globally, Australia. The whole planet is feeling someone, Donald Trump, who spent his entire youth avoiding the draft to Vietnam, now being in charge of this, what do you call it, military excursion, he sometimes calls it. And someone who one day is talking about glory to God, and the next minute, praise be to Allah. So in his completely deranged posts on Truth Social. And this exposes the US empire, this Pax Americana, increasingly. And this idea, I mean, if we look at the beginning of the 21st century, they refer to themselves as the order based on international law. Now, I mean, this rules-based order, which replaced that because they were not adhering to international law, they're not even adhering to their own selective rules. So...
And since you mentioned international law, I'm going to get back to that point again with Dr. Shannon. But then first, I suppose Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi wants to say something economically speaking about the previous point.
Economically speaking, I can talk to Mr. Dorosh, and we just would like to remind him that for the last 50 years, America have always the military power, but they lost in Korea, they lost in Vietnam, they lost in Afghanistan, they lost in Iraq. So Mr. Dorosh said that you have the capability to go and continue. I don't think it's that easy to say. And then he mentioned also about the rescue. For one pilot, you have 200 soldiers that were there and 20 planes. The cost of it is enormous. We are talking about 2 billion a day now for this war. And if it was that easy, why the Minister of War go to the Congress and would like to have 200 billion to continue? Simply because a drone costs $5,000 to $15,000 to produce for Iranian, and the Tomahawk call 1.5 million. Here, I think economically, America cannot sustain this war. It's impossible. Again, and I said, Iran is as big as Europe. It's 95 million people. It's 3 million soldiers waiting for this. I don't know where Mr. Dorosh gets his impression, but my reading of it is they are not going to stand. Economically, it's not bearable. It's too expensive. 200 billion, I think the American at the kitchen table, they are talking and say, look at what they were saying, the manifestation that you have these 3 days. In the beginning it was, we don't want a king, which he was Trump, he was acting as a monarch. And then he said, we don't want the war. And then what you are saying, we don't want this war doing by proxy for Israel. And it was the first time that we heard that. Meaning that economically they understand the burning of it already. The bar is only 110 or 112 because America, as I said, doesn't suffer about that. They have it. It's just a question of the way they are going to handle it, and it's not possible to continue on this track. You talk about inflation, you talk about stagflation, but also the wake-up call is here now. The wake-up call is here. They said, why are we doing this? And I think when you see the Europeans who are part of the NATO, they don't want to follow Mr. Trump. So this military power is not playing the role that they're supposed to play. What they are telling him, okay, you want the war, do it by yourself. We are not going to help you to do it. And now he's cursing at them, he's insulting them, etc., etc., etc. I think the wake-up call and the reality check is what? Is this war should not happen. It's very costly for the American. If the global trade that is being disrupted, they are going to stabilize. You know, we take the 1973. But meanwhile, for fighting against the resilience and the endurance, Iran can sustain it. Not America, neither Israel.
Mm-hmm. And I think I have to give the opportunity to Mr. Dorosh to respond after your comment, Mr. Mohammed Krissasi, at least to highlight perhaps the superiority, if we come to speak about superiority when it comes to technological power, when it comes to military capabilities, and even when it comes to financial capability, Mr. Dorosh. Even if, let's say, USA emerges victorious, at least in the battlefield, from this war, I mean, whose interest is it going to serve?
Yeah. Well, first off, I got to tell you, it's always a pleasure to speak to people who can pronounce my name right. So I don't get that very often. And I think that's about the limit of the respect I've been shown by the last speaker, but I'll take it. Look, where do I get off of? Well, I worked in the Pentagon for 15 years. And a lot of people, I suppose the way to look at this is like the Justice League movie, where you got Superman who can fly, you've got Wonder Woman who can, go in her invisible airport. You've got the Flash who can run through walls, and then they turn to Batman and say, what's your superpower? And he says, I'm rich. And that really is a superpower. So I know this seems like a lot of money, but in normal peacetime, the Department of Defense spends about $1.2 billion a day, just normal peacetime. The real impact that's being felt in the U.S. is not from the defense budget or the money spent. It is from the price of gasoline, the increase in the price of gasoline, which is due to the Iranian disruption of, and I have to emphasize this, neutral civilian shipping, most of which are sailing in Omani territorial waters. And honestly, the longer that continues, I think it's more likely that the American public will support increased expenditure if they see that it will bring gasoline down. When you talk about the value of the equipment that's expended here, it's important to bear in mind that when, for some reason, when analysts talk about military equipment, they don't take depreciation into account, but it does depreciate. So a lot of the aircraft that are being used, for example, the aerial tankers, the last aerial tanker was built in the year I was born, 1963, the last KC-135. And those are being used right now. 2 of them were damaged due to a mid-air collision in this. But they've been paid off and amortized years ago. Your distinguished guest mentioned the defense request. There's a supplemental request for operations because the main DoD budget reflects the desire to modernize the force, something that's been kicked down the can for years. And there's some expensive bills there, things like remodernizing the nuclear weapons arsenal. I don't think your viewers would be aware that the United States hasn't built a nuclear weapon since 1988. So those are due to be remodernized along with the delivery vehicles. And then finally, I would dispute, and I think that if one were to go to Seoul, I don't think they would call the Korean War a loss. It is true that Afghanistan, Vietnam were losses. But those were ground campaigns and are in areas where we don't actually occupy and hold land. Think of Kosovo. We tend to have a little bit more favorable record here. President Trump has indicated no desire to occupy, and he has disavowed regime change as the name of the military campaign. He thinks economic power is going to do that. He thinks sanctions are going to do that. So there's a lot there. I didn't address all of it, but I appreciate the offer to do it. And once again, I appreciate you all pronouncing my name right.
Okay, let's move on now to Dr. Shannon. Dr. Shannon, earlier I just interrupted Dr. Simons when he started talking about international law and order, which leads me to this question again. Would you, especially having read a really lengthy essay by Robert Kagan when it comes to his warning, saying that the USA has now become a rogue superpower, so when Robert Kagan issues such a warning, it does carry sort of a weight. So does this reflect maybe a deeper fracture within the U.S. strategic consensus?
I think that there is certainly a fracture, and there are, I would say, 3 general groups of thought around this. One are the folks around the president. The second are the more traditional foreign policy and strategic experts. And then the third are folks in the public who don't have that expertise, but certainly have thoughts about this. So around the president, you have a group of people whose strategic thought is that whatever the president wants, they're going to back it. And so you see that coming from members of the administration. There's also the faction of fairly, I would say, extreme Christian evangelicals who support Israel and who have supported this war against Iran because they would like to see the apocalypse happen. And there have been complaints coming out of the U.S. military that message was coming from the Secretary of Defense and being told to soldiers. And so they were making complaints about this. So there's that group. And I would say they're in the minority, but they're the ones with power right now. Among more traditional foreign policy thinkers, what I'm seeing in think tanks, academia, as well as people who've been in government for a long time, many of whom have been removed because of the reductions in force. They're very skeptical of this war. They're very critical. They tend to prefer the United States to only go to war when it absolutely has to. When it does, they would prefer that the U.S. have clearly stated reasons for the war, clearly stated goals for the war. Those goals need to be practical and achievable within a certain time frame. And then they want to see the U.S. have a clear strategy for ending the war and getting out. Sort of based on that Powell doctrine that Colin Powell came up with back in the 80s. And, we haven't seen the administration really meet those goals. And this community tends to also prefer that the US act in concert with its allies, whether that's through NATO or through other alliance systems. But this administration has really done damage to those alliance systems. And as some of my co-panelists have pointed out, those traditional allies are declining the US request to become more involved in this war. And I would say among the traditional experts, historians tend to have the final word, and we tend not to be kind to policymakers who don't seem to have clearly thought things out or who cause a lot of damage to the US or to the world. So we'll see how historians decide to judge this. And then among the public, I mean, there are strong feelings about this war. The majority of Americans do not support the war. This administration made a surprising decision not to lay the groundwork to get the public on board before starting the war, and their efforts to get public opinion on side so far have not succeeded. And there are folks on the right who are part of the America First contingent of President Trump's base of support who oppose the war, who've always opposed this kind of intervention and want the US to focus on its domestic problems. And so they're very unhappy with what's happening. And then there are folks on the left who also think that the United States needs to step back from being the world policeman. This is articulated by folks like Senator Bernie Sanders, where they want the US also to focus on things at home. And so strangely, although they dislike each other, we see some agreement between factions on the left and the right that the US should be focused on things like the inflation that's happening in the US, like healthcare, like education. And so they're really unhappy with the decisions that are being made in Washington. And I think that their unhappiness is mirrored by the unhappiness among the traditional foreign policy expert class, although the reasons for that unhappiness are different. So I would say the majority of Americans, whether they're experts or not, are really very unhappy with what's happening.
Great.
So there is definitely a fracture.
Great. Let me include now Ms. Adeshua. Ms. Adeshua, what are you gathering when it comes to this fracture within the U.S. strategic consensus? Are we witnessing perhaps these concerns gaining traction, or maybe are dissenting voices still being sidelined? How do you see it?
Well, everything she just said, I totally agree with. Plus the fact that there is a widening narrative gap. Actually, the U.S. media and a lot of people in the United States are trying to navigate a fragmented narrative environment. There is evidence that shows that there is a clear divergence in who the aggressor is and who the victim is. And that decision, that consensus, that perception is not even homogeneous within political parties. So, for example, you see a Senator John Fetterman just 6 days ago saying that the press is helping Iran with selective coverage of Operation Epic Fury. This is someone who was a Democrat and who's saying, no, look, you're not doing a great job, telling the press that they're not doing a great job. So some policymakers also argue that the U.S. media is too critical or selective, allegedly underplaying the success of the United States in this war. So clearly you cannot put everybody in one box, and more as the war unfolds, people are also changing their mind and their position. So the whole thing is in flux, how people are seeing and understanding the war and the actions the government, the United States government is taking by day is making a few people who supported the whole concept of the war from the beginning to begin to question where it is heading, when it is going to stop. I mean, for example, in policy circles, like she mentioned earlier, people are now beginning to question the strategic clarity of this war, the long-term feasibility of military goals. In the political square, you can see there have been reports, Political reported a couple of days ago, just before Operation Epic Fury went into full swing, that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was like the voice of reasoning in the White House, questioning, shall I say, allegedly skeptical of whether or not this is something that should be launched in the first place. Others are questioning the cost. I mean, there's just this whole broad spectrum of why are we doing this? Are we actually going to? How do we describe the success this war. So, and then of course in the media ecosystem, you know, all of that dumps down into the media ecosystem in terms of, you know, there are critical perspectives. It's just that they're not mainstream. All right. So whether or not dissenting voices are being marginalized, I think the way I will address that is they're not fully suppressed, but they're not your go-to. That's basic. Yeah, they're not fully suppressed. People are expressing confusion, I think, is the first. Why are we even doing this when we still have issues of healthcare? Why are we doing this when the price of groceries has gone up? Why are we doing this if we voted based on the concept and the idea that America will not go into another war? Oh, yes, self-defense, but my groceries are still very high. There's still, I can't pay for fuel. Gas has gone up. So there is a lot of confusion.
But Ms. Adishua, we have seen, I mean, it was sensed that there was increasing pressure on dissenting voices, indeed, in Western democracies. And some of it might link it to a reason for security. Others, they just say that they are trying to control the narrative. But then dissenting voices are being sidelined. Indeed, I mean, when we see the President Donald Trump himself calling journalists names for asking the right questions and saying that they are working for certain agendas, or perhaps they're just spreading fake news. I mean, what does this say to you?
This says that people just want to protect their source of income. When you find the self-preservation at the end of the day is what takes precedence, what becomes the most important thing when you have people in power challenging the very soul and very source and very integrity of the work a lot of journalists do in this country. So when there is a lot of pushback and you have networks wanting to protect what they've already built over the years, what you see is that people don't push back. Even if they will not do it in the way that you have seen journalists do in the last 10 years, 15 years. At the end of the day, there's a lot of censoring, allegedly. People cannot, the way that journalists would have done their job in the past and questioned certain things, they are, based on research, based on what we've seen in the last couple of months, are not really able to do it. Not like they would have done in past years. So there are dissenting voices for sure. And is there suppression? Well, at the very least, they're not mainstream, is what I would say.
And this leads me to you, back to you, Dr. Shannon. Historically speaking, what happens when governments narrow the debate during wartime? Does it unify or does it divide societies long term?
I think it depends on the government. So I'll take the two combatants, the United States and Iran. In the United States, historically, there has always been a fierce debate about war. The only time we've really seen a lot of unity was in World War II, and that was after Pearl Harbor, and then after 9/11 when the US entered Afghanistan. And in both of those cases, the US was attacked. But historically, there might be social pressure to be pro-war and be patriotic, but there was still the freedom in most cases for people to speak out. The last time that I remember the state really intervening to suppress speech using state power was during World War I under Woodrow Wilson. And that caused more division, I think, than unity by suppressing pro-German or anti-British voices at the time. The current administration certainly has been trying to narrow speech in the United States on a variety of issues, not just this war. We've certainly seen a change in the newspapers of record in the United States, like the Washington Post, and their coverage because of who owns them. But we can see that the American public still has space to express themselves, and whether it's through social media or through less dominant media outlets, we see a lot of this pushback happening, and shows like this one, even though it's not U.S. based. In Iran, the Islamic Republic has suppressed speech and pushed its own narrative for the last 47 years. And what we've seen is there's a huge gulf between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. And that gulf is not going to be narrowed by the regime trying to force everyone to get on side with this war right now. The Iranian people are not going to suddenly think that the Islamic Republic needs to be propped up. What I'm hearing from Iran is that the Iranian people, they don't want to be bombed. A lot of them didn't ask for this war. There's a real divide over whether people think the war is a good thing or not. And that comes down to whether they think the war will actually overthrow the Islamic Republic, which is what the majority of Iranians want right now. They're afraid of being killed. They're afraid of what the United States might do tomorrow. But the number one fear that I'm hearing from them is that the Islamic Republic will still be standing at the end of this war. And in that case, their resentment against the regime, they'll just add that suppression of speech to their already long list of grievances against the Islamic Republic. So I think in both the US and in Iran, you see more division and you see more distrust of government happen when people don't have the freedom of expression. But in the United States, we have the First Amendment still.
Thank you, Dr. Shannon. And now, Dr. Simons, perhaps a different kind of division. When we see Europe refusing direct involvement, do you see this as strategic distancing, at least for the time being, or maybe it's a sign of a deeper fracture?
Well, it's been a distancing, a gradual one, and Trump 2.0 has definitely been helping this distancing. We saw how servile the Europeans were. When von der Leyen came crawling to Trump on a golf course, in between rounds he was playing, and capitulated economically to this one-sided so-called trade deal. So, they definitely have a slave mentality towards the US, not the Trump administration. And of course, this current thing is not helping because it further alienates ordinary citizens from this. So we can see that, you have likes of Spain, and the fact that Trump lamblasts different so-called allies, where he talks about Macron getting beaten by his spouse, shall we say, and makes fun of it. Or if we go beyond Europe, where he tells the Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, to kiss Trump's posterior, that he will need to kiss his posterior. And I would take issue, actually, with Iranian public opinion. Anyone who has been to Iran and this Shia understanding of the world gets a different sense. I find that it's a much more open society to political debates than, for example, some of the things in Europe with the different taboos. And one would also note that there are different expats returning from, for example, Europe to Iran because they see their homeland being destroyed by what they refer to as the Epstein class, this Operation Epstein's Fury, these different ironic and sarcastic comments, what is driving the US. You just look at the memes coming out of the US, for example. I saw one particular one coming out where Trump and Reagan meet, and Reagan says that I destroyed the Soviet Union, and Trump replies, and I destroyed the United States. So I don't think there's a good understanding from outside the global South the unifying factor this has created. And this nonsense about Trump's alleged 45,000 protesters killed, that's just plucking it from, somewhere nasty. And what's more, Trump just admitted that he supplied the so-called protesters with weapons. He admitted that on live. And this is going on top of what Mossad has been admitting before. Mossad is standing with you. I mean, and Pompeo's remarks and so forth. So I think it's, you can see if you look beyond the Pahlavi kind of narrative, that it's something quite different. This is a unifying moment. They might not agree with the Iranian government, but of course, as has been noted, when you get attacked from the outside, and that she used Pearl Harbor and 9/11, there is a tendency to unify rather than to split.
But Dr. Simons, from a global perspective still, who is seen as escalating this crisis?
The US is seen as escalating in the name of Israel. I mean, well, I wouldn't even say in the name of Israel, because what Netanyahu is doing is not in Israel's interests. It's in Netanyahu's interests. So in this respect, both Trump and Netanyahu display some similar characteristics. They're both narcissists, and they both have a high degree of megalomania. Trump is gone into a war of choice and now fights for his legacy, because remember, I mean, this is not the first time he has attacked Iran under the cover of negotiations, perfidy, by international law illegal. And this nonsense that he was a peace president has, well, where has that gone? And Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival, and for that, he requires constant war. Otherwise, he's going to be taken out of power and put into prison, not for genocide or any of those things, but for corruption and abuse of political power in Israel, which is why he's invading Lebanon, Syria, and just doing what Israel does to its neighbors.
Thank you, Dr. Simons. And now back to you, Mr. Mohammed Kureisasi. So if we're going to speak about economy, we're seeing perhaps reaction. We have seen reaction happening domestically, as you mentioned, let's say, what was happening in the United States, right?
Yes.
So how long before we can see a reaction all over the world, and maybe beginning with Europe, before this becomes real? Let's say, economic domestic crisis?
Well, in the United States, to answer the first part of the question, I heard that you talk about oil. As I said, and I reiterate, America doesn't import oil, they export oil. That's number one. Two, what hurt the economy also of America is not only the oil and the Iran issue. It was before, with the tariff of Mr. Trump. And this is what hurt the average American at the kitchen table, as I said. When you have 50 to 60% of your goods coming from China, and you want to impose a tariff, then it impacted already. And then come the war that I said cost $2 billion a day, and they asked for 200 billion to continue this war. And also, just for the record, when we said, my gentleman, I'm sorry if I didn't say his name right, but he said when America didn't lose the war, they lost 30,000 soldiers during that war. And I think even if they didn't lose the war, they lost 35,000 people, and we have to take it in consideration. Now, to come back to the economy, we have the example on 1973. It will take maybe 1 month, 2 months after the war, and I hope it will be done by that day. The economy is going to go back on the right track. You see, the oil today is only at 112. The inflation is part of it. Maybe you are going to have 3 to 4% inflation. But again and again, when all this go back on the track, America is going to recover from this. Europe is another issue. Europe, they need the oil. Europe, they need to get together to say that you don't want to go to that path, and you have to do a front against Mr. Trump, who want to impose also tariff of them. So now I don't know how we can ignore this fact-checking. We have really to look at it with the cold head and say, this is the truth, this is not the narrative or the systemic discourse that you heard from Mr. Trump and his cohort of all crooked politicians. I'm sorry if I take off your time here, but I try to understand the best I can. But you have to go back to the basic and see what is the roots of this war, for who, by who it is done, and for who is done. It's not for the American. It's not for the European. It's for two warmongers, Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, who both of them have trouble in their own country. Trump with the Epstein file, which now appears that is in it up to the neck, and Mr. Netanyahu, who is involved in corruption and fraud in his own country. And I would like again and again to my honorable audience to take this in consideration.
Mm-hmm. And I get back to you, Mr. Darash. When we are speaking about all this economic disruption and what's happening or how the economic markets are actually reacting to every speech that Donald Trump is making every single time he has a press conference or he, posts something on Truth Social, can all this mess, or let's say whatever is framed as strategic goals, justify this level of global disruption, or is there perhaps a growing disconnect between military objectives and global consequences?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think that the operation was undertaken with the expectation that there would be so much disruption to the global oil market in particular. By the way, Dr. Mohammed, I was praising you for pronouncing my name correctly. I wasn't criticizing you. I was very pleased. I don't think that there's that was taken into account. I think that the level of disruption, particularly domestically, as your previous speakers have noted, the level domestically is a big issue. We have midterm elections coming up in November. The Iranian leadership are very, very close students of the American political process, and they know that traditionally in the midterms, the president's party loses seats in the House and in the Senate. So they also know that if they can keep oil prices high, which keeps gasoline prices high into the summer, then the chances are pretty good that President Trump will have a resounding defeat in November. But if President Trump is able to restore the normal trade before, say, mid-June, then I think he's banking. He's really gambling his presidency on the idea that Americans will say, well, this has been a 50-year problem for American foreign policy that has been solved, and it was worth 2 months of high gasoline prices, high grocery prices. Of course, prices always drop more slowly than they can. There's been a lot of discussion about the media, the global media, the accessibility. I would point out that traditional press releases are not really the way things operate these days. U.S. Central Command tweeted out an update on how the battle goes just 2 hours ago. And there are regular on YouTube briefings by the commander. Of course, the president talks probably more than his staff would wish he wanted to. And I haven't heard any indication of restrictions other than access restrictions, which are normal in times of war. It's just that this is one of the first big major conflicts we've seen where you have social media, which is really dominant, and people kind of choose their own source and choose what bubble they choose to reside in. And unfortunately, they find a narrative that kind of suits their own needs. There was something else that I heard that was really incorrect. Oh, the casualty numbers of the protesters. Of course, Iran is a closed country, unlike the United States. The regime in Iran has said only 3,000 people were killed. Time Magazine, The Guardian have all reported that there are in excess of 30,000 deaths. Time, in its January issue in particular, said that in just 2 days, there were more than 30,000 fatalities at Tehran area hospitals alone. I think that a number in excess of 30,000 is perhaps is probable. I don't know where President Trump got the 45,000 from, but there's a lot of people speaking to him. And of course, there are no shortage. If you just Google about the deaths, one thing you'll hear is that not all the people killed were reported and made it into official figures. So certainly it's a number larger than 3,000. Oh, there was also a misreading of Trump's remarks that he tried to send weapons to the protesters. He explicitly said, we tried to do this, but they were intercepted by people along the way and never reached the protesters. And then finally, I've known Mike Pompeo for 44 years, and I have great respect for him, but he has no information from the U.S. government. His sources of information are the same as ours. So I think that on the current war, you can cite his judgment and his analysis, but you cannot treat him as a definitive source on really anything because he's not part of the political process. So
clear. The idea is clear, Mr. Derache. As we are nearing the end of this special coverage, I would like to give a very brief final word to every single one of you. Hopefully we can have enough time to do this. And let's begin with you, Ms. Deshua, since you wanted to say something, but briefly, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I just want to point out to the fact that, yes, there's a First Amendment. It has been respected. This is a country that was built on the principle of free speech. And, you know, some of the greatest journalism the world has ever seen has come from here. However, there is a consensus, especially among journalists, that might not be really mainstreamed, of the fact that people are very cautious about their work in this environment and how they go about it. When you see colleagues like Don Lemon, who is an independent journalist, was arrested while reporting a story, and also Georgia Ford, who was also arrested, for reporting, basically. Some of these journalists are, people some of us looked up to and respected a lot. So even though there is no direct suppression per se, there is just a feeling among some journalists that it is becoming harder to do their job the way they're used to. So there's a cautiousness around it. However, the platform to still do the job, people are going independent. There is Substack. There are tons and tons of platforms where people are doing factual reporting and still able to do their job. There's just this anxiety around, oh my God, if I do this reporting, do I need to be ready for what may come? Whereas it never used to be the case. So that's the point that I need to get to.
Thank you, Ms. Deshua. What about you, Dr. Shannon? Do you think this is a war of necessity or a war of choice? But briefly, please.
Well, I'll just say it's a war of choice, but I would like to comment about the Iranian people. I think you can be against the war without adopting the Islamic Republic's line. And I think it's a real disservice to the Iranian people's agency to suggest that they're somehow put up by foreigners when tens of thousands of them come out into the streets. These are educated people. They know what they want. They've been very clear about what they want, especially since 2022. They've been explicitly nonviolent. And they have suffered a great deal, and they're suffering more because they're now caught in between a war from outside and their own government. And I think we need to remember the real people who are right there in ground zero. Anyway, so war of choice. I think anytime if the US's homeland is not attacked, most wars tend to be wars of choice. In this case, the lack of real clear rationale for the war has really made it very clear this is a war of choice. If this is about the Iranian nuclear program, the president has signaled that he's not interested in securing Iran's uranium, as well as some other confusing things that indicate maybe it's not really about the nuclear system. He has early on said it's about regime change, and he's claimed that they've changed the regime, but it's still the Islamic Republic. And if anything, they're more hardline and more defensive than they were. He said we should take the oil. And so is this about resource control. Like all of these things, though, are not absolutely necessary. And I don't think he's made a strong case that this was a war of necessity.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Shannon. Mr. Mohammed Christasi, briefly, please.
Yes, I will. I just would like to address Mr. Trump and to tell him to read again the Constitution of America, which read, "We the people." And we the people are the only one who is supposed to go to ask to do the war, because this war, Iran didn't aggress America. Therefore, go back to the Constitution, read it again, and this is an illegal war that he's doing to the cost of American citizens, and they are against it. And thank you.
Thank you indeed. Darash, a quick word.
It's an honor to speak on an Algerian motive. This is my first time doing this. I've been trying to get to Algeria for 35 years, and I've never been able to. Look, America is a complex country, and our system of government is complex. I would just urge your readers to follow the example of some of the distinguished experts here. Take some time to study the American system. It's not the same as the Australian, Canadian, or British system. And understand that if you don't like one American leader, just tread water for a while, and there'll be another one coming down the pike.
Thanks you indeed,
thanks for your
Mr.
interest.
Darash. Thank you indeed. And Mr. Greg Simons.
Yeah, well, I never said that there was no agency of the Iranian people. There is agency. You had both Mossad and Israeli media bragging about arming and fomenting those protesters to go against not only the Iranian security forces, but also the people. And there are plenty of video evidence of this. I mean, I don't believe a damn thing which the US government or mainstream media says. They have a track record of lying, deceiving, cheating throughout every single war they've been in. And this is yet another example. I think ultimately the fact that Iran is still going is showing the delusions of Donald Trump in the West that Iran was some kind of paper tiger. I mean, the same kind of delusions that led to the conclusion in the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe and would fall easily. These same things repeat from history. And yeah, I mean, it's right. History will judge. And this may well be the moment, beginning in West Asia, where Pax Americana unravels. And I mean, the world is going to be a much better place for that.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Simons. Thanks to all my panel of guests, each one of you by the name. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A war that was meant to be short is becoming structural. A conflict that was meant to be contained is becoming global, and from shifting ultimatums to contested airspace to rising economic pressure, this war is no longer just about Iran. It is about power, it is about credibility, and increasingly, it is about consequences. The real risk may not be defeat on the battlefield, but the erosion of the very system that shaped the modern world. Thank you to our guests, and thank you to our viewers for watching. I'm Karim Fazakari, and until next time, have a good one.